volunteer with the village, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our session on legacy planning. We have some wonderful speakers lined up for you this morning from the Community Foundation of Greater Washington. And this is a virtual event, as you can see. By now, I'm hoping everyone is quite accomplished with using Zoom. For those of you who are not, a little quick tutorial and quick intro to our ground rules. If you scroll on your screen, you can see that there are some buttons that will pop up, including a little button that says chat. And if you push the chat button during the presentation, you have a chance to type in your question to the group, so or to the speakers, so as not to interrupt the flow of the conversation. The other thing you can do is go over to a button that looks like a little happy face with a plus sign over it, called Reactions button. And if you are so inclined to indicate you really like something you hear, you can do a thumbs up, which is now appearing on my screen, or you can do an applause. More likely you'll want to ask a question, and there is a button at the bottom that says raise your hand. And as the moderator or a reviewer of comments, I will let Rebecca or Russella know that there's a question out there. And after the question is, after you're called upon, the button comes up and you can hit lower your hand. So hopefully that orients everybody a little bit. I want to thank everyone that helped with setting up this session, including both staff and other volunteers, Tamika Lee, Mary Bloodworth, Deborah Hanlon, Karen Stuck, and I hope I haven't left anybody out. And today we're going to hear a little bit about legacy planning. This is part of the larger initiative in the village, fondly called GIPIO, which is somewhat unfortunate acronym for the Initiative on Getting Your Papers in Order. So it's a little bit difficult to pronounce, a bit of a mouthful, but it's been a wonderful initiative that's helped us all at that stage in life where you start thinking ahead. What kind of imprint do I want to leave? What kind of bequest do I want to leave in the world as you move on? I want to start by introducing Samantha Schiffman, who is here representing the village, and our director, Judy Berman, who couldn't be with us today, but is also delighted to have this program going on. And Sam, as most of you know, who are members of this village, Sam is our director of volunteer and care services. So without further ado, I will mute myself and pass the baton to Sam.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I'm so glad to see everyone here. I'm really happy to be here and welcome the Community Foundation, who Anne was saying support donors and nonprofits in the greater Washington area, and have also been great supporters to Capitol Hill Village. This is such an important topic. And through getting your papers in order, we were just talking before we got on the call, it's just really nice to see how Anne was able to get some information and bring it to the village community, which is really what we're trying to do with getting your papers in order, is learn information and share it with each other. So it's really exciting to see that happen. I'd also love to introduce our wonderful speakers today, Rebecca Rothey and Russella Davis-Rogers, and I also have a little bit of information to share about them. So Rebecca leads the Greater Washington Community Foundation's outreach to professional advisors, private foundations, and business leaders in the region. She provides strategic guidance on contributing close-held, complex, or illiquid assets on charitable legacy planning. Prior to joining the Community Foundation in August 2016, Rebecca held several charitable gift planning positions, including a year at the Johns Hopkins University as Director of Gift Planning, 8 years at Catholic Charity as Director of Planned and Principal Gifts, and 4 years at the American Red Cross of Central Maryland as manager of major and planned gifts. However, it was her 3 years serving as director of major and planned giving from 2012 to 2019 at the Baltimore Community Foundation that created her passion for the role community foundations played, helping generous people make their communities better places through philanthropy. Rebecca received her undergraduate degree in philosophy from the Notre Dame of Maryland University, from which she graduated summa cum laude and is certified as a fundraising specialist from Goucher College. She became a certified fundraising executive in 2004 and received her designation as a chartered advisor in philanthropy from the American College in 2014 and her accredited estate planner designation from the National Association of Trusts and Estate Councils in 2018. Rebecca serves on the editorial advisory board of Planned Giving Today. She is past president of the board of Chesapeake Planned Giving Council. And I'd also love to introduce Russella, who joined the Community Foundation in March 2020 as Director of Donor Services. In this role, Russella is responsible for developing, managing, and delivering a tiered system of services to engage, inspire, and strengthen the relationship between the Community Foundation and its donors. She joins the Community Foundation with over 13 years experience in the nonprofit sector, local and federal government. Prior to joining the Community Foundation, Russella served as the Senior Manager of Development for Turnaround for Children, a nonprofit that works to accelerate healthy students' development and academic achievement. Before Turnaround, Russella served in President Obama's administration as the Chief of Staff and Strategic Partnership Office at the U.S. Department of Education. In that capacity, she directed the administration of the department's gift funds, which averaged about $1 million per year, advised the Director of Strategic Partnerships, enhanced partnerships of the development of the department by connecting philanthropic and business organizations with initiatives aligned with the administration's priorities, and served as deputy of President Obama's groundbreaking initiatives and My Brother's Keeper Task Force. Russella has received local and national awards, including the Spirit of Detroit Award from the Detroit City Council, awarded to Detroit citizens for their commitment of service to Detroit residents, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Drum Major of Service Award, and the President's Volunteer Service Award, honoring ordinary citizens for their extraordinary volunteerism work. Russella holds a Bachelor's of Business Administration and Marketing from Howard University and a Master's of Liberal Arts with a concentration in African American Studies, Ethics, and the Government from Johns Hopkins University. And with that, I will pass it over to Rebecca and Russella. Thank you again so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks to Anne and the team of volunteers who invited us to present this morning. And thanks, Sam, for those lovely introductions. It's always, I always enjoy the chance to participate in events of this nature. I'm still getting used to Zoom because I am an extreme extrovert and I would much rather be in a room with you face to face. But hopefully we're getting there pretty soon. So someday we'll be thinking back to the old days when we had to do all of this on Zoom. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And let me go to slide presentation from beginning, slideshow, resume slideshow. There we are. Hopefully everybody can see those. And we're off to the races. So you already know who we are. We had those introductions. We will skip that. The way this presentation is going to go, we're going to just give a very brief overview of the Community Foundation and what the Community Foundation is, because it provides the context for why we're sharing this expertise. Then I'll spend the fair amount of time through the presentation talking about estate planning and various methods for achieving your philanthropic goals. So my focus is really specifically on estate planning as it relates to philanthropy. And then Russella is going to share an example of how to roll your sleeves up and really get into the nitty gritty of doing grant making in Washington, D.C. With an example of a program managed by the Community Foundation. We do want to allow time for questions. Anne's going to be monitoring questions, and she will interrupt if there's kind of a pressing question in a specific topic rather than make that wait to the end. So happy to take pauses to answer questions. And we confirmed that we actually have the Zoom past 11:30. So we may go to likely 11:45 or perhaps slightly later. And of course, our contact information is in the slides. And if there are questions that you would rather ask confidentially, Russella and I will be available afterwards, and always happy to respond to emails, schedule a call, take time to talk with you. So with that,
Well, so Rebecca, I will practice interrupting now, just to let everyone know that we are recording the session. So if you wish to turn off your camera for some reason, that's fine. We do like to see a reaction on the screen if we can. And as Rebecca said, I'll be monitoring the chat, or you can hit the raise your hand button for a question. And the slides will be made available after the fact as well, if you're wondering that. So I'm back to mute.
Okay. So the Community Foundation is one of about 800 community foundations across the country. And all of us are typically based within a geographic area, and were created by representatives of the community in order to be a central platform for philanthropy within the community. So we're created to support donors who want to give, and we do that by creating charitable funds for those donors. So we sponsor those funds, and I'll explain how that works a little bit more in a minute. And then we, through those funds, make grants to nonprofits in the region, and so we support the nonprofits in the region. So we manage philanthropic assets, and these can be by individuals, but we also manage foundation and corporate assets. And then we distribute those as grants into the nonprofit community and for charitable purposes. Our overarching mission is to build thriving communities. Our geographic footprint is the district, Prince George's, Montgomery County, and Northern Virginia. We're 47 years old, and you'll see our batting averages in just a minute. But our core mission is to disrupt poverty, foster human connection, and lead efforts for the future of work and workers in our region. And so in addition to managing the philanthropic dollars of individuals who identify their own charitable purpose, we also raise and deploy what we call discretionary dollars, dollars where we're selecting the charitable purpose, where we're the grant maker. And these are the areas in which we focus our current grant making. So this is our batting average slide. I am not going to bore you by reading this to you. This is also a little outdated because we have the world's funkiest fiscal year. It ends March 31st. Don't ask me why. So this is for 2019 because we just closed our 21 fiscal year. And so we have to update data, but it gives you a ballpark idea. And I think the key takeaways from this are that in our history, we've granted a total of 1.3, this is now 1.3 billion, this number on the bottom. We're now 47 years old. And that's money that's deployed 70% into the region, which means that the Community Foundation is by far the largest grant-making institution in the greater Washington region. We don't have large private foundations, a Rockefeller, a Mellon, a Carnegie. And so it's really our community of givers who are the biggest givers in the DC region. So we're different. You know, some of you may be familiar with Fidelity, Vanguard, Schwab. They're platforms for donor advised funds, and donor advised funds are one of the types of charitable funds that we offer. And about 20 plus years ago, Fidelity got a letter from the IRS that said, yes, you corporation, you can set up a charity, and that charity can sponsor donor advised funds. And that has proven to be a very successful loss leader for Fidelity. Fidelity does not make money on the charitable gift fund. It does make money on the assets that are managed through that charitable gift fund. And that has in fact actually become the largest charity in this country. Last time I looked, it had something like $35 billion, which is good news for Fidelity, but really, frankly, good news for the nonprofits that are receiving all of the grants from that. So we have no complaint there. It serves a very valuable purpose in terms of convenience and vehicle for philanthropy and the grants that are made to donors, but it's not based in the community. And what makes community foundations unique is that we are deeply rooted in the communities that we serve. We know community needs. We work with nonprofits and with donors to address those needs, and we deploy philanthropy locally. And I think the best example of the power of that is that during COVID-19, Fidelity was contacting community foundations to ask them who they were granting to in response to the COVID-19 crisis, because there's no way that Fidelity can know that for every community across the country. And we did, in fact, actually create an emergency response fund during COVID-19 that raised and deployed $10.5 million in response to that crisis. So we had a very comprehensive answer to that question. So we're community-based. We're driven by our mission. We offer a full range of philanthropic solutions, and we'll get into that in a minute specific to estate planning. And we also offer opportunities for learning and engagement. And as I've already said, Russella is going to give you one example of that at the end of the presentation. But again, back to COVID-19, because it's still very fresh in our minds, because here we are all on Zoom still. We hosted through the summer a series of 8 social justice town halls that we convened after the murder of George Floyd, which really intersected with the work that we were doing with COVID-19. So for COVID-19, we convened a weekly phone call that had generally 60 to 80 foundation executives, United Way, all of the various nonprofit collaborative organizations, other community foundations, elected officials. And we did topical calls every week on a specific area of what we needed to be doing to respond to COVID-19. So it was a collective learning opportunity with featured speakers to coordinate grant making regionally. This was so effective. It was actually highlighted in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, The Economist. It was actually unique across the country. And that was initiated by our then brand new CEO, Tonya Wellens. But then we also did these social justice town halls, which were 1-hour webinars, typically with a panel of 3 or 4 speakers, the health disparities, access to education, gun violence, all these various topics. And we invited our whole family of donors to participate in those in order to learn and also then to be a more effective grant maker. More recently, I saw that you're going to be having a book discussion of CAST. We hosted one of those about a month ago. So some very much, a collective learning community. So now to get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty, I'm going to start just by giving high level the types of charitable funds that we offer, and then I'll go into estate planning. So I've already talked about donor advised funds. They are what they call, you set up a fund, you get a charitable income tax deduction when you create it, and it's the same as it would be for any gift to a charity. And then you retain the right to recommend where the money goes. You may name your children as successor advisors. So many folks use a donor advised fund as a way to make philanthropy a family activity. Unlike Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, community foundations offer other types of funds. So donor advised funds, every commercial gift fund, if you have a financial advisor, likely your financial advisor is now on a platform that offers donor advised funds. And I will tell you quite honestly, our donor advised funds are more expensive. Our fees are higher because you're getting all the community service behind them. It's not merely a commercial product. And there's nothing wrong with commercial products. We're just different. So we also offer field of interest funds. And I'm going to use an example from Anne, if Anne doesn't mind. Anne is very interested in environmental education. Well, the Community Foundation currently manages several field of interest funds that were actually created by a private foundation. And when it terminated into a field of interest fund. It's public, it's called Spring Creek. And one of the foci of this fund is environmental education. So we have a field of interest fund into which we're inviting other donors to give or to leave a legacy. And that every year, the Community Foundation will direct grants specific to environmental education east of the river in this region. So the benefit to a donor is you can have a charitable purpose in mind, like environmental education, but you don't have to do the work to figure out who's the best in class doing that work. That's done by the Community Foundation through a committee structure that has community representatives representing that area of interest. We also offer designated funds, which is very simply, you set up a permanent endowment, and I'll talk about how those work in a minute, that says, I love the Capitol Hill Village, and I want to support Capitol Hill Village in perpetuity. You know, I've been giving them $500 a year, and I want them to keep, well, it's, yeah, 500 is good. I want them to keep getting that. You can set up a designated fund with $10,000, and every year that organization will get that $500. And I'll explain the mechanics in a moment. The benefit of this is, you know, is Harvard going to go out of business? Probably when that meteorite hits the planet, you know, that might happen. You know, there's certain institutions that there's not that much concern that they're going to go out of business. But if you support, you know, animal welfare, if you organizations, if you support local arts organizations, if you support, you know, child service programming, there are many kinds of organizations that are much smaller. In fact, there's a terrific resource, if you're not familiar with it, called the Catalog of Philanthropy. And it catalogs all organizations with budgets less than $2 million. And there's a lot of them. And those organizations are vulnerable to going out of business. So with the designated fund, you designate an organization, but the Community Foundation uniquely, and this is in our bylaws, and this is true for all community foundation, can vary a purpose if the organization goes out of existence. So it can vary the designee to a most closely related organization. Example, Baltimore had a designated fund for lyric opera. It went bankrupt in the recession. That fund still funded opera in Baltimore. So again, this is a unique opportunity through community foundations to perpetuate what you care, you know, the specific organization as long as it exists, and then the purpose of that organization in perpetuity. And then, of course, we offer scholarships. We are actually in the process of creating a centralized scholarship fund, which is going to focus on closing the racial wealth gap. So it's going to, instead of being an achievement focused, which is very typical of scholarships, it's going to be economically focused in the area where students need the greatest assistance. So top ways to give in 2021. Current gifting, if you're over 70 and a half, you can make a direct transfer from your IRA to a charity. And what will happen is you can give that up to 100,000. There's a lot of confusion right now because last year, the CARES Act, you may recall, changed the year for your first required minimum distribution to 72. So a lot of folks thought that that also changed the qualified charitable distributions from IRAs, but that's not the case. So as soon as you hit that magic 70.5, and who knows why it's 70.5, but as soon as you hit that number, you can ask your IRA administrator to make a direct gift to the community foundation or your charity of choice, and that money will not be included in your income for income tax purposes. So it's actually now more tax advantaged than making a cash gift, taking the deduction, because with the SALT limitations, it's very hard to get over the standard deduction, even with charitable giving. And so if you just lower your adjusted gross income, you're actually lowering your overall effective tax rate. So it's a great way to give. The only bad news is you cannot do that for donor advised funds, but you can do that for field of interest funds, donor designated funds, and scholarship funds at the community foundation, which means like if you have an organization and you just know you want them to get support forever, you've been giving them, you know, an annual gift, they mean a lot to you, you can take an IRA rollover in 1 year and set up an endowment, and they'll get that support forever, and you don't have to write that annual check anymore. Another technique is bundling into donor advised funds. And this, you really got to run the math with your accountant, which I am not. But because, again, we're at that limitation of the SALT taxes, the state and local income taxes, and the mortgage deduction, and that's been capped at 10,000. As I've already said, it's very hard to get above the 12,000 or 24,000 standard deduction unless you're doing a lot of charitable gifting. So what some people are now doing is giving into a donor advised fund every second or third year. And in that second or third year, they're then taking an itemized deduction rather than using the standard deduction. And then they're doing their annual giving over that 2 or 3 years from that donor advised fund, which is helpful to nonprofits because nonprofits rely on your annual giving. And if you give in 1 year and then don't give for the next 2 years, it becomes much more difficult for nonprofits to plan and budget. So it's a great way, again, to have a bucket of money from which you give. And if you have your accountant run the math, it's a little counterintuitive, but actually the higher the deductions that you get above that standard deduction, the greater the benefit. Don't ask me why, but I've seen the numbers and it's kind of funky. So it's definitely worth talking with your accountant about. And then the last one is cash, that good old friend of ours, cash. This year, again, with the renewal of the stimulus package in February, you can actually give up to 100% of your adjusted gross income in cash. So that's a pretty unique circumstance. Likely, it would be most beneficial if you have a property sale, if you have a wealth event of some sort, you can max out that AGI, and then you are allowed to carry that forward. It's also useful, like if you are talking with your financial advisor about converting from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA, when you make that conversion, you have to pay the ordinary income tax on the conversion from the traditional IRA. Your tax bill will be higher. If you have cash that you can max out as a gift to offset that, then you actually get the offsetting deduction. Keep in mind, no charitable gift is free because you're giving away money. You just get the tax benefit for giving the money. And I didn't put on here, but I just want to add a footnote. If you're not already aware of this, gifting appreciated stock is always more tax effective than cash, because keep the math simple. You have Microsoft stock, you paid $10 a share. It's now worth $100 a share of 100,000, don't we wish, but $100 a share. You gift those shares, you get a full fair market value charitable income tax deduction for those shares on the day that you make that gift. So those shares cost you $10, but you're getting a charitable income tax deduction for the $100 of the fair market value that you're gifting. You owe no capital gain tax on that increase. So the percentage of your AGI deduction is lower, but the gift costs you far less. So again, if you're thinking about making current gifts, always talk to your financial advisor. Is there some kind of stock in your portfolio that it's maybe coming down that you'd like to rebalance? You can always rebuy that stock at a lower basis, but it's a terrific way to gift. So that's the bonus information not on this slide. So now we're into estate planning techniques, life income gifts. And my guess is that for those of you who are philanthropic, you are probably getting marketing pieces about these. I would be shocked if you're not. I used to write the marketing pieces for these. In fact, when I was at Catholic Charities, since it was mentioned in my bio, I called it Rebecca's Recipes for Planning Gifts. And I dressed myself up in my grandmother's apron. And I did these little cards, like I made myself eating a cake, and it said, yes, you can have your cake and eat it too, because you can make a gift and get income for life. So if you get marketing pieces like that, know that it's folks like me who are sitting there trying to think of a way to get you to be interested in making these kinds of gifts. But they're very beneficial for the right kind of donor. So they're called life income because basically what's happening is you're making a gift, and part of that gift is income back to you as the donor. And it's important to know that in some of these, part of that money coming back to you is actually your own money. That's true for charitable gift annuities, not true for charitable remainder trusts. So charitable remainder trust, you set up a trust, you have to work with a lawyer, you have to actually create a trust. If you're working with your alma mater, they tend to have law firms that will help you with that, but it's always good to have your own lawyer check it, even if you're getting an institution to help you write the trust document. In that document, you're going to pick a payment rate to yourself, typically 5–10%. Usually it fails if it's not greater, if it's greater than 10%. And you can set it up so that you get 10%, or let's keep it 5%, which is more typical right now. Every year that trust will be valued. So January 1, the investments in that trust are valued, and then you get a payment of 5% of that valuation. Those payments are taxable, so you need to be careful when you're setting this up. If you don't need more taxable income, this is not a good tool for you. If you want a lifelong income stream with an offsetting deduction and you want to leave money to the charity you love, can be a great method for creating income. So what will happen then is that'll be taxed, the tiers of tax. It starts with what worth first, ordinary income, and then the taxation comes down. And you get that, you can set it up for either as long as you live, as long as a child lives, or you can also set it up for a term of years for up to 20 years. You cannot gift IRAs to this. The nonprofit sector has tried for a long time to get that changed. Someday, maybe we will. Charitable gift annuities are similar, but the rates are set by the American Council on Gift Annuities. They're based on a combination of anticipated returns and actuarial tables. This may come as a surprise, but people who are philanthropic live longer. In fact, the Community Foundation has a woman who set up a charitable gift annuity with us who is now 103 years old. So there's actually a joke in the sector that if you want to live a really long time, set up a charitable gift annuity because guaranteed you will outlive your life expectancy. It's just one of those rules. So based on those calculations, you get an annual payment. That payment is fixed. It is not adjusted for inflation. And that payment is part return of principal and part the growth in that asset. So what the IRS expects that asset to be earning over your lifetime. So the rates can get pretty high. I haven't looked at them recently, but if you're over 80, they'll be in the probably high single digits or even up to low double digits. So they're worth looking at, particularly if you've got a nonprofit that you're already leaving in your will. You can create a gift annuity instead. What will happen is the nonprofit gets whatever's left over when you pass away. So it's a great way to create an income stream for yourself, but at the same time, leave a charitable bequest. As I said, they're not adjusted for inflation. So if you're in your 60s, when the payment may look high now, but when you hit the 80s, it won't be so high. The other thing is that increasingly there are fewer nonprofits offering these because the nonprofit is actually assuming a liability. It has to make those payments to you as long as you live. And even if that annuity goes underwater, unless you renounce your payment, they're legally obligated to make that payment to you. So there are still nonprofits that offer them. I would kick tires pretty carefully if they're interesting to you. For example, the Community Foundation no longer offers them because we segregate by fund, and we need to make sure the money's there for the nonprofit that you would want to support through that gift annuity. We didn't have a large enough pool to justify that. So I would look to larger organizations and look to the size of their annuity pool, because that's going to tell you that they're going to be able to make those annuity payments to you for as long as you live. And then charitable lead trusts are this sort of rarefied air of life income gifts, because they're the reverse of what we're talking about. With a lead trust, you set up a trust that makes an annual payment to a charity. And then at the end of the term, there's always a term, the balance left in that trust goes to your heirs, and it goes to your heirs free of estate and gift tax. Well, right now, the estate tax exemption is 11 million and change for a single and 22 million for a couple. There are not many folks who are over that exemption. And so this is a technique that is right for really specific fact patterns. If you like the idea of creating an annuity stream for a nonprofit with money going to your heirs tax-free, talk to your estate planning attorney. All right, estate gifts. This is the bread and butter of all nonprofits. About 90% of all charitable bequests come in the form of estate gifts. So you can do testamentary planning. Testamentary just means after you're dead. Planning with charitable remainder trusts or charitable gift annuities. Charitable remainder trusts have actually come back in favor as a planning technique for children, because as part of the Secure Act, Congress changed the length of time that a beneficiary has to spend an inherited IRA. So it used to be what they called the stretch IRA, which was you have a big IRA, you work somewhere where you accumulated a huge IRA, and you name your daughter as beneficiary. Used to be your daughter could take the payments for those IRA over her lifetime. Now she has to take it in 10 years. So what happens is that if your daughter's, in her 50s, in her prime income earning years, she's now also having to spend those IRA assets in that period of time, which means even if she then puts them into something that she can use for retirement, she's still paying the tax on it, which guess what is why they changed the length of time to 10 years to capture that tax revenue. So what you can do is leave an IRA to a charitable remainder trust created by the executor of your estate. And in that circumstance, you can name your daughter to get income for her lifetime. And that, because it's coming out of your estate as a charitable gift, it's a tax advantaged way to set up that charitable remainder trust. So it kills two birds with one stone. First of all, your IRA is not heavily taxed as an inheritance by your daughter. It's also not included in your estate for estate tax purposes. And then, sorry about that. And then in addition to that, your daughter then gets that lifelong income stream. And depending on how it's invested, that'll control how it's taxed as she takes that income. So definitely, if you're doing estate planning, talk with your estate plan and your philanthropic, you know, because obviously at the end of the day, you're not giving your daughter a chunk of money. You're giving her an income stream, and then you're leaving a charitable gift. So got to be philanthropic. But if you are, it is a great technique for turning particularly those most expensive assets into in your estate into a charitable gift. And then I also mentioned charitable lead trust, so I won't repeat that. Let me just add here that the most common way of leaving a bequest is to name a charity in your will or to name a charity in your trust. You can also name charities as beneficiaries of your IRA. So if you're doing estate planning and you have an IRA, but you also own property, appreciated property, and you have just an investment portfolio, and you're trying to juggle what do you want to leave to your kids and what do you want to leave to charity, it is always best to leave the IRA to charity because that asset transferred to charity from your estate is free of estate tax. So if you claim the IRA as part of your estate, you're having to capture the value of that for the total valuation of your estate. And then we've also talked about how that'll be taxable to your heirs. So again, definitely talk to your estate planning attorney about your asset portfolio. Be proactive about sharing that you're philanthropic. As surprising as this may seem, not every estate planning attorney really promotes these gifting techniques. There's a huge spectrum. I meet with estate planning attorneys all the time. Some love philanthropy, really promote it. Others are like, oh, well, you know, if a client asks me, I'm there to do what the client wants. So you got to be really proactive in making that happen. The other thing is just, you know, if you name a charity in your will or your trust, which you can do with a community foundation, and you can do that for any of the types of funds that we discussed, although I will mention that probably the best method as an estate gift to the community foundation is that field of interest fund, because it just gives you so much flexibility about the purposes that you want to support. But it's a good practice to have you or your attorney reach out to the charity. Obviously, you want to get their correct bequest language, but if it's an organization larger than, you know, a neighborhood dog shelter, you want to make sure that they know exactly what the purpose is of the gift that you're leaving. If it's a university, if you just name that university, it's going to go into their annual fund. But if you went there and you have a faculty member you love and you want to support the sociology department in perpetuity, you got to create a gift agreement with that university. And I will tell you, those gift agreements really vary. Kick the tires, talk to your attorney, do your due diligence, because you're leaving what you worked a lifetime to accumulate. And you want to make sure with that gift agreement that it's going to your intended purpose. Okay, that was the bonus prize for this slide. Endowments. I love endowments. And I talk with donors who are considering leaving legacies through us about them every conversation I have, because unfortunately, endowments have gotten a bad rap because you say the word endowment now and everybody thinks Harvard and, oh, they've got all that money and why do they need to have more money? They think they do need more money, and they'll actually make a case for why they think they need more endowment money. But that's, you know, a separate conversation. But, you know, a typical endowment for a nonprofit is one of the most valuable things you can leave. And I always do the math by saying, you know, let's go back to that. Let's just keep it really simple. Let's say you're, you've got an organization and you're giving them $1,000 a year. and I always am going to get the math wrong because I'm particularly when I'm public speaking. But so you're giving them $1,000 a year, and you want to perpetuate that. Well, so what happens if you set up a $20,000 endowment? What will happen is, so you set up a $20,000 endowment. Most nonprofits, and we at the Community Foundation calculate 5% of usually the average of a few years' earnings. We use 3 years, sometimes it can be as much as 5. That's done to protect the principal, to kind of smooth the market fluctuations. So what will happen is 20,000 endowment, that organization gets $1,000 a year every year. We'll multiply 1,000 times 20. Guess what you get? 20,000. At year 21, you're giving more money. That $20,000 probably grown a little bit. It's still there. And you're still giving that $1,000, and you're doing that forever. And there are many institutions, the Smithsonian Institutions is funded through endowment. Many colleges, arts organizations, they're really powerful tools. And quite frankly, we're all on this planet for this really, a nanosecond in the scope of human history. And we're all mindful of our mortality, which is why none of us like doing estate planning, because there's nobody who wakes up in the morning and says, today's the day I want to pay a lawyer thousands of dollars to contemplate my death. There's just not one person who likes doing that. But what we do like is the idea of leaving a little something that's going to live beyond us. And that's what an endowment does. It's that little piece of immortality, not the money, but what you care about, that you're perpetuating the things that you care about. And obviously for those who have children, children are an important part of that most of the time. But our lives are more than our kids. We've been touched by our educational institutions, by our ski club, by our knitting circle, by wanting to be an inspiring artist, by loving the Kennedy Center. And, I'm an opera fan, and I've missed live opera this past year more than anything else. So those are the things that we can memorialize through endowment giving. I understand Capitol Hill Village has an endowment, and it's a great way, if you care about Capitol Hill Village, leave an endowment in your estate plan. Make sure you have an agreement with Capitol Hill Village that they know you want that to go to endowment. And if you do this as a lifetime gift, because you can do endowments either during your lifetime or through your estate, it's the same tax benefit that you would get as a gift to any other charity. And with that, mouthful, I'm going to hand it over to Russella.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good morning again, everyone. Thanks for having us. I want to be mindful of our time, so I'll be brief. And before I jump into our sharing funds, I also want to alert each of you that Anne is a current member of Sharing DC and can also be a wonderful resource if you have questions about participation. Sharing DC is essentially a giving circle. It is a committee of community members like yourselves who, in partnership with the foundation staff, agree to an issue area and then select a group of nonprofits to award a gift. We usually select a new issue area each year, and the gift amounts depend on how much the sharing committees raise for the year. Our members typically give a gift of at least $5,000, and then the resources are pulled together to deploy to the nonprofits. During our most recent grant cycle, we awarded over $160,000 to 6 nonprofits focusing specifically in workforce development. And these were actually renewal grants. Due to COVID-19, instead of selecting a new issue area, we allowed our previous year recipients to apply for a renewal grant because we anticipated that many nonprofits, as a result of COVID, would not receive the usual resources or the opportunities to seek out additional funding. And so instead of putting that additional pressure on them to seek new funding opportunities, we granted them the opportunity to apply for a renewal grant, if you will. We have sharings across the region. So we have a sharing Montgomery and a variation of it as well in Prince George's County. And it's just a really wonderful opportunity to learn more about the work that the Community Foundation is doing, as well as how you can be involved and sort of take a baby step into your philanthropic journey if you've not yet done so before. Many of our committee members actually have a fund here at the Community Foundation. And then those who do not, they use this as an opportunity to learn more about our grant making process, about the nonprofits in the area and how they can be most supportive. So they're getting an education. It's a real learning journey, and you have the opportunity to do so with a group of like-minded individuals to make sure that the resources are having the greatest impact. I think that's it. We do want to share that most recently, 2 of the grantees, oh, thanks, Rebecca, for moving on to the next slide. 2 of the grantees are part of the Southeast area. Southeast Ministry and Urban Ed are located in Southeast DC. Again, they were previous year awardees and they received a renewal grant during this most recent grant cycle. Usually the grants are only for a year, which is why having the opportunity to provide these particular grantees with a second award was really, really, really meaningful for them. We are examining our sharing programs as a result of what we've seen and experienced and witnessed from those that were able to receive renewal grants. And we're thinking through, instead of awarding just a grant each year, possibly offering multi-year grants, because we see that a lot of times the programs that we are supporting are the ones who are struggling a bit financially. And we want to make sure that they're having the opportunity, and so are we, to have the greatest impact. Usually for Sharing DC, due to the amount of money that we have, our grantees usually are somewhere between maybe 4 to 8 that are receiving an award. And again, it's pooled resources. And we want to make sure that everyone who's receiving the grant, that we're being able to make the biggest impact. So I will pause there. And I think now we can open it up for any questions anyone may have, Rebecca.
So our contact information is in the slide. I just wanted to show you that. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see all of you.
So this is Anne. Thank you so much for the presentation. I've been monitoring the chat box. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat just yet. You can also raise your hand in front of the camera and we can call on you to ask your question. I want to offer again that I found it very helpful to work with the foundation. The presentation you've heard today talked a lot about the vehicles for giving, which is kind of, I say, kind of a left brain activity where you understand the mechanics of giving. The other piece that was very helpful was the assistance that the right side of my brain got, and the heart, which was clarifying the purpose. In other words, what kind of legacy was it that I wanted to leave? I'm a person with few family members, no kids, and anything I don't manage to spend on travel, I wanted to make an impact in the world. And Rebecca, it was helpful to talk about with you, clarifying my purpose. I know one of the things you did was to give me a sample of a letter that President Obama wrote to his daughters. Would you talk a little bit more about the practice of clarifying your purpose? And then we do have a question from Mary Albert after that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Anne. I love that you put this sort of right side of the brain, left side of the brain. And of course, when I give a talk, I immediately go to that right side of the brain. But what we find, we use a practice, and we do this both for estate planning and also for legacy giving, that is really a process of appreciative inquiry. We're not trying to tell people what to give or how to get, with the one caveat that if we're doing discretionary fundraising, for example, we have a partnership to end homelessness in the district. So we fundraise for that. So if you care about homelessness and want to make a collective impact, then yes, we'll say give to that. But for the process of planning an estate, it's about that little piece of you that I mentioned, you know, that you're leaving on this earth, that little piece of immortality. And that means that you're bringing the entirety of your life and your experiences to that process. And, you know, it's very frequently sort of like a funnel, and it's often not a straight line process because it actually isn't easy to figure out where you want to leave what you've worked a lifetime to accumulate. And you can reach a point where it's like you think of this, the whole spectrum of things that you've cared about, and then how do you codify that into something that you're then leaving afterward? So it's not uncommon, you know, to sort of start that and then get stuck. There's actually a name for that, which is paralysis by possibility. I actually work with one fellow who, I mean, I had him do the same exercise that Ann did, which is, okay, well, write down everything that you cared about and that's important to you. And he came back with a list of 15 things. And then he said, I'd have to be Bill Gates to be able to fund all of this, you know. So, you know, he then got stuck like, well, how do you choose? And that's where you go to your values. And that's why I shared the letter. It's called an ethical will. Obama wrote a beautiful one, but there's a practice called writing an ethical will. I hate the term. Yeah, I don't like the term will in that because but the reason why that was chosen is because you're bequesting your values. You're bequesting what's been most important to you in your lifetime. And you're writing that in a letter to, you know, it's often done for children, but it can also, in this case, in Ann's case, she wrote one to the future grantees and why she chose the purpose areas that she did for her field of interest fund. And that letter is a reflection of her values that will then guide how we make those grants on behalf of the bequest that she created. And, you know, for those of you who are comfortable writers, you know that actually writing really does help clarify your thinking. I'm actually in the process of preparing another talk, and so I wanted some quotes on this same topic. So I pulled out the famous Polonius to Laertes, you know, in Hamlet, in which he says, "To thine own self be true." And if you think of that, a bequest that Polonius was leaving Laertes, or Socrates when he was on trial, you know, one of the things he said was, you make sure my kids don't get focused on making money. You know, you make sure that they always live a virtuous life. That was Socrates' ethical will, you know, that sharing of values. And so our process is to take as much time as it takes for you. I worked with one fellow for 2 years. These are often not easy things to decide because it is that love part of your brain. It's not your transactional brain. It's the love part of your brain, which is making these decisions. And another benefit of using the Community Foundation for this is that we have a way that we can structure this so that you can actually evolve in your planning over time. You can name the Community Foundation and name your fund, because we always give funds name, but then over time say, wait, you know, I had this letter with you and it said I wanted to support arts organizations, but now I want to add racial justice, you know, because I think that's important. Well, we can adjust that. We can really clarify and specify that, but you don't have to go back and change your will or your trust in order to be able to do that. So thank you, Ann, for encouraging me to include that in this conversation. I really appreciate it. And in case you didn't know.
What's that?
I was just going to say, and in case you didn't already know this, Ann was a blast to work with. So but you already know that because you know her.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let me go ahead and call on Mary Albert, and then we have Harriet Rogers with a question after that.
Okay.
Mary, you want to unmute yourself? Or there we go.
I've done that. So my question is, if a person has already has a donor advisory fund held by a Fidelity or a Schwab or another financial services group, can a grant be made from that advisory fund to the community foundation, and how would that be done? If so, would there need to be a specific sharing DC or specific that you put together?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question. I appreciate it. So it can be done one of two ways. We actually have a number of folks right now who are closing their commercial gift funds and opening a donor advised fund with the community foundation because they want to be part of that community benefit and they want their money to be local. And they want to get the learning opportunities. So in that case, you would open a fund with us. You know, it can be donor advised fund or it can be any of the other types of funds I described. And you would request a grant from Fidelity to that fund because we're both public charities. So you can go from one donor advised fund to another and close your fund at Fidelity and then just transfer that money via grant from your Fidelity fund to your new fund at the community foundation. Very simple process. You can also make a grant as a gift, as you would a charitable gift that you would make from your donor advised fund to any nonprofit. So you can give to Sharing DC, you can give to the Partnership to End Homelessness. We have an initiative in Montgomery County right now called Food for Montgomery. We were asked by the county to help close the pretty terrifying food insecurity gap there. It's 100,000 people a day going hungry right now in COVID-19. You can also give directly to the community foundation. We have what we call a Fund for Greater Washington, and that supports the leadership work that we do in the community and grant making, discretionary grant making. So the key thing when you make that transfer is you got to be really careful on the grant recommendation to specify what it's for when we receive it from Fidelity or Vanguard. And if you're going to do it for a donor advised fund, make sure you have the donor advised fund with us open first, and then we would accept that gift into the donor advised fund.
So could not go directly. I couldn't treat it. It could not go directly to DC, Sharing DC. I would have to have the intermediary advisor fund with.
No, so you can make a direct gift to Sharing DC from your donor advised fund. You would just indicate on your grant recommendation, Greater Washington Community Foundation for Sharing DC. And then we would treat that as a gift, you know, that we received.
Thank you. And as I mentioned, there is a question in the chat box from Harriet Rogers about the endowments. Harriet, are you okay to unmute yourself and ask a little bit more about the area of concern?
Yeah, no, I just had, well, now I have two questions based on what your previous answer to the previous questionnaire. My first, though, is just something I'm wondering about. You know, many of us made more money than we thought we would this year in the stock market. So my question is, I usually give to my niece. Well, it's through a college fund. A college fund's already been established, and when I can, I put money into that fund. The question is, what is the advantage or disadvantage of doing this year, because I can do it, going ahead 5 years? In other words, giving the max, which would be, I guess, $75,000 for 5 years. Is there an advantage or a disadvantage to that?
So this is a 529 plan?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not an accountant and I'm not a financial advisor. So I know charitable gifting techniques enough to be educational, but I think that's a question for your accountant, because what you would want to look at is the tax offset from the gift to the 529 plan against your overall adjusted gross income. So you got to really do number crunching there to make certain that because I don't even know if you actually get a deduction for a gift to a 529 plan.
No, you don't. It's just there's a max you give, which can be 15,000, I think, a year. But there's also a one-time opportunity to give for 5 years.
Yeah, you got to run that math with your account.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
And the other question is this is based on your answer to the other woman. Is the community foundation, is your foundation a 503c? I mean, so you can donate to your foundation?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So we're 501c3,
Yeah, okay.
under the IRS 509A,
Okay.
yeah. And all community foundations are, but also Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab, they are as well. So any organization that sponsors donor advised funds is a qualified 501c3 organization.
So you can get it directly.
Correct.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. This has been a good presentation.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
And I see here in the chat that someone asked if you could clarify your role with Sharing DC. So if you could do that, and if there's anything else, I can fill in that gap.
Thanks, Russella. Yes, after I worked with Rebecca on setting up a fund, which I also want to say was a fairly stress-free process. Again, as I mentioned, my circumstances are fairly simple. There's not a lot of kids or relatives to take into account. So I was basically just able to execute a straightforwardly and set up a fund. As Rebecca mentioned, I also designated the fund as a beneficiary on my IRA account. I then had questions about, so once I've designated this purpose in a broad brush way through a letter of understanding, which was, again, fairly low stress and easy to execute. It was a letter of understanding with the foundation and the name of my fund. Then the question was, well, how does this work exactly? As it turns out, I come into this process with a background. I worked over 30 years at the education department in a number of capacities, including grants administration. So from there, Rebecca put me in touch with the Sharing DC initiative. And I've been involved in reviewing how the grants were executed. It was a grant monitoring role that I had. As Russella mentioned, these grants during COVID were renewals. I believe that's the correct term. And so we talked with the heads of the nonprofits and their staff about what did you do with the money? And did it accomplish the purpose it was intended for? And it was a very interesting process to hear about. It was workforce development money for very vulnerable populations. And during COVID, in-person training had to stop. All these organizations had to figure out how to give online training, again, to these very vulnerable populations that don't have electronic devices. They don't have iPhones. They don't have iPads. They didn't even have access to Wi-Fi. And it was, during this difficult time for all of us, for me, it was very rewarding to hear how these organizations were able to use this money and still help people get important job training skills. It was further complicated during this environment because a lot of the jobs we were training people for example, in the service industry, the jobs dried up. So not only did you have to reboot with the training, you also had to figure out, well, how can we get these people back to work? Can we get them with FedEx or some of these other shipping industries, which were in fact growing during the time of COVID. So I felt like I was able to contribute something. I was glad to give back, but more than that, I found it a very rewarding experience. I got something from it as well. Anything
And
you want
with,
to say, Stella?
were you done, Anne?
Yes.
Okay, and with sharing, you see in an ordinary year or our sharings, we also conduct site visits. And so the committees are usually able to go and visit the various nonprofits and see them in action, which of course with COVID, we were not able to do this year. And so Anne and the committee members were able to participate virtually. And this is when the nonprofit leaders just scheduled a time with us to talk through the work that they were able to do and how they were able to pivot in light of COVID. And they provided a report as well that the committee members get a chance to review in advance of meeting them, and or would have had the site visit if possible. So it's not an intense process. It's fairly enjoyable. The Community Foundation, we are with you along the way. It's a very fun group. Wouldn't you say, Anne? Very fun, very smart, super engaged.
Very smart.
Yeah, and we usually select, again, we'll select the issue area, and that's in partnership with the committee members. And going forward, we're looking exclusively with focusing potentially on our COVID relief work. The foundation has taken a very strong stance with our racial equity and inclusion work, as well as some of our neighborhood partnerships. So as Rebecca and I were mentioning earlier, making sure that we're having the greatest impact in the highest needs communities is very, very important to us. So as we think through how sharing is going to look moving forward, we want to make sure that the issue areas are very mission aligned with the work of the Community Foundation as we think through this next era or so of our work.
Thanks, Russella. So I'm going to issue a last call. We're about 10 minutes away from having to release our Zoom link. And I'm going to ask if there are any other final thoughts or questions. Again, the contact information is on the slide deck. We can make that available to anyone who's on the call, or actually to anyone who's interested within the village. I see nothing else in the chat. Rebecca and Russella, I want to thank you again so much for a very wonderful and informative presentation. Harriet, are you raising your hand?
No.
Or are you adjusting on your screen? There you go, muting yourself. Okay.
Well, thanks again for the invitation. Really appreciate it. And very nice to see each of you. Hopefully that'll turn into a see each of you sometime soon. But please do feel free to reach out. And as you just saw, if we can't answer the question, we can get you to a place that can. So thank you. Really appreciate your interest.
Thank you so
And
much.
Sam, I'll give the final words to you.
Thank you. I did just want to say thank you again so much to Rebecca and Russella. This was really informative and I appreciate it. And also a big thank you to Anne also for sharing a bit about your experience, which was really helpful in kind of framing what it might look like for someone who would be working with the Community Foundation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.
You too. Bye, everyone.